right. Good morning, everyone. Happy World Ocean Week. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll give it another maybe 30 seconds before we get started, but welcome and thank you so much for being here. All right. I think it is time to get started. Welcome and happy World Ocean Week, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Portscast today as we learn about saving Monterey Bay. So, during our time together today, we're going to be exploring the Monterey Bay from two different parks here at Asilomar State Beach, which is in Pacific Grove, California. And we'll also be looking around and learning from Point Lobos State Natural Reserve. Ashley, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Isabella. Happy
Morning.
World Ocean Week to you and everybody that is tuning in this morning. I am here at Point Lobos State Natural Reserve, located in Carmel, California, maybe about 20 minutes south of where Isabella is right now, and super excited to show you all around Point Lobos this morning.
Thank you, Ashley. And we're so excited that you're here and excited for this program today. So, we're going to be spending about 45 minutes together, and we are going to be learning about some of the conservation success stories here in the Monterey Bay. So, there are multiple species that we'll be talking about today, some really cool animals that, through dedicated conservation efforts where people have worked together, they have made a comeback and have recovered from being almost hunted to extinction. So we're really excited to get to share those stories with you all and also just learn about some of the really cool animals that call Monterey Bay home. But first of all, I did want to also introduce myself. My name is Isabella, and I work for California State Parks as an interpreter. Ashley is an interpreter as well. That means we have the really fun job of getting to share information and tell people all about the cool things that you can see and do in these California state parks. And I would really love to show you all what is going on in the park I'm in right now, Asilomar State Beach. So I'm going to flip us around and let's just take a moment and enjoy the view.
What a beautiful day at Asilomar, Isabella.
It is so beautiful. Very appreciative of the sun and the nice temperature. I'd guess it's maybe about 65 degrees. As we're looking around and taking in the view, turn to a partner, or if you are taking notes or drawing, maybe you can take a moment and note some observations. What are you noticing? And what are you seeing as we're looking around at Asilomar? Looks like there are observations of rocks. We are definitely surrounded by rocks on this rocky shoreline here. You also might see all the water coming onto the beach, crashing waves. Maybe you're noticing different colors in the water, some blues and greens and white color from the foam. And you also might notice the tide pools. If you see some rocky areas like right down below where water is getting trapped in the rocks, those are the tide pools, one of our really cool ocean habitats and home to one of the animals that we will be talking about today. Ashley, I'll pass it over to you. Do you want to take a look around Point Lobos right now?
Yeah, thank you, Isabella. And it's a beautiful day here at Point Lobos as well. I'm standing on a trail just above Whalers Cove, which is named after one of an animal that's been spotted here in the cove, and one of those animals that we're going to be talking about a little bit later today. Let me go ahead and flip us around here and give you a nice quick view of how Point Lobos is looking today. And as I'm moving us around, go ahead and also make some observations, maybe note some differences between Point Lobos and Asilomar.
Wow, it is so beautiful there, Ashley. Love the view.
It's not too windy right up here above the cove. But if we look a bit off into the distance outside of this cove, it looks pretty windy. We can see some white caps uh, going across the surface of the water here. But it's about the same temperature here this morning, about 60, 62 degrees or so. And we're not the only ones celebrating World Ocean Week here at Point Lobos today. Just on the other side of the cove, right here, we have some divers getting ready to go into the
Cool.
water to explore this underwater forest, this kelp forest. And if you tuned in yesterday, we took a look at some of that kelp on from the surface of the water, and then on Friday, we'll be taking a look underwater. So getting all the different vantage points of this kelp forest at Point Lobos. And I'll go ahead
Wow.
and pass it back to you, Isabella.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, it is so nice to take a look around Point Lobos. I saw some great observations in the Q&A. People were noticing that the water looked a little different at Point Lobos versus here at Asilomar. And Point Lobos have a lot more plants. You're kind of in the pine forest. So we got to see some of those beautiful pine trees, some cypress trees too.
Yeah, and along those lines, right above me, we have a beautiful cypress tree.
Oh, oh my gosh. They are so pretty. Yeah, I love that Point Lobos has the forest right on land, and then we have that kelp forest, the underwater forest right next door. Really cool to get to see all those different habitats in our parks. So Ashley and I are both in the Monterey Bay. And this is a really amazing place. So we are in the middle of California. Um, and it has been used by people for thousands of years. We got millions of visitors visiting the Monterey Bay, whether that's in Santa Cruz or here in the Monterey area. And there are all sorts of things for people to do here. Maybe some of you watching have even come to visit in person before, or maybe you might like to after our program today. So, as we're thinking about all the ways that people use the ocean, I would like to pose that question for you all. Turn to a partner and share what are some ways that you think people use the ocean. You might try to think about things you've done if you visited the beach before, or things that you'd like to do in the future. Well, let's take a moment and think about what are some ways people use the ocean, maybe some ways that the ocean helps us and benefits us. Looks like there are some excellent ideas in the chat. The ocean can be a source of water for us to drink. It can also be a place where we find lots of different life, lots of different ocean life that maybe can be seafood or just cool things to look for if we're visiting the beach. Ashley, what are some ways that you like to use the ocean?
That's a great question, Isabella. I love to use it in a lot of different ways. One is I love using the ocean for scuba diving. And I also love just going for a nice long walk on the beach or enjoying a beautiful sunset and also exploring the tide pools where you are at Asilomar.
Yeah, those are such cool things to do. Um, and yeah, the ocean is definitely a place where we can play and recreate. There's all sorts of activities from tide pooling, getting to look for little critters in that habitat, to scuba diving, to surfing, kayaking, swimming, all sorts of things. And the ocean is also a place where we find a lot of food. If any of you watching like seafood, it is a major source of food for people all over the world. It's also a place for us to be learning. There's a lot of really cool research that happens here in the Monterey Bay, including Mbari, which explores the deep sea habitat here in the bay. So it's a place for us to do research in and learn about and feel inspired in and relax, maybe even find spirituality into. So it has all sorts of uses, and people have had different relationships with the ocean for thousands and thousands of years. But unfortunately, in different parts of human history, the ocean has also been used really heavily, where sometimes we were overfishing or overhunting for different animals, or even algae and seaweed like kelp. And that has been sometimes unsustainable, where people were taking so many of these animals out of the ocean that there weren't many of them left. Maybe y'all can think about if there's a word that describes when there is not many animals left. Anyone have any ideas? What is that word to describe when there aren't many animals left? You were saying endangered. You were correct. So sometimes when people are overfishing or overhunting, animals can become endangered. And then that can sometimes lead to them becoming extinct, where there are none of them left. And sometimes extinctions can happen naturally. You might have heard of the way dinosaurs went extinct, which was a meteor crashing into Earth, or sometimes times when the climate has changed, like during ice ages, that has caused species to become extinct. But there are also times where humans, because we've been fishing or hunting, have led to species becoming extinct, where there are none left. And we are really excited to share some stories today about animals that have come back from the brink of extinction. So where they almost went extinct, but now are coming back, and we can find a lot of them around. And it really fits into our theme of World Ocean Week this week, because the theme is taking action for the ocean and for our climate and working together to build sustainable futures. So we're really excited to get to share some stories about times that humans have already done that. And one example is working together to save this animal. Maybe take a moment and make some observations about what you're seeing, maybe some guesses about what animal this might be. You might notice this big, beautiful shell that's kind of a pinkish color. You might even see some black spikes surrounding it. This is a type of sea snail. It is a type of really big sea snail called an abalone. And they have this beautiful shell that kind of serves as an exoskeleton. They use a foot to grasp onto rocks. And they actually live right behind me. So this is part of their habitat that we were looking at earlier, part of the rocky tide pool habitat. And these snails are herbivores. So they like to eat different types of algae and seaweed. They especially like to eat drifting kelp. So they can slowly move around the rocks and look for different pieces of kelp that they can munch on. What is super cool about these abalone is that the word from them actually comes from the Rumsenaloni people, which is the local tribe here in the Monterey area. And as they have lived here for thousands of years, their word for abalone is alone. And when the Spanish came here, they ended up adopting that word and making it into the word abalone as we know it today. And the Rumsenaloni people have had a long history with these abalone, where it was a food source and continues to be a source of the shells, especially jewelry and regalia, and even shovels, where they are using the shell as a shovel. So that is a really cool connection the Rumsenaloni people have and continue to have a relationship with this really cool snail. And also different groups of people throughout history have also eaten this snail as because it is a really tasty seafood. And Ashley, I would love if you could share a little bit more about that history because I know Point Lobos has a connection there too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Isabella. And yes, here at Point Lobos, in addition to the Rumsen, there are also the Chinese and Japanese that use this abalone. The Chinese first arrived here in about the 1800s, and they were looking for abalone right along the shallow edges. And when they arrived, they understood the importance of getting a variety of food sources. So they would start with the abalone and then switch to sea urchins and squid throughout times of years. And then after the Japanese started arriving and they were also looking for abalone in the shallow waters. But when there were no more easily accessible in the shallow waters, they turned to a new technique of finding these abalone, and these used these little boats and created the first version of scuba diving. They donned a hard hat like from those picture like those ocean movies with explorers going in the deep water wearing those thick metal helmets. And then the divers would be in the water, and people on board would use hand pumps to get air down to the divers. And when those abalone were collected, they were then brought onto shore. And just on the other side of the cove here, let me spin us around here again. Right across on the other side of this cove, right on this point, right over there, it's called Cold Shoot Point. And at the time when the Japanese were drying these abalone, there weren't as many trees there. And so let me go ahead and share a photo of those drying racks. So let me see. Here we go. And so in this photo, you can see all of those abalone drying out in the sun. And in the background of this photo, you might be able to notice a building right below the hills in the background. And that is the cannery. And so that's where the abalone were brought to be processed. And it was called the Point Lobos Canning Company. And when Point Lobos became a state reserve, the cannery was taken down. But let me stop sharing. If we continue panning back in this direction, in the distance where this parking lot is, that was where that cannery was. But once Point Lobos became that natural reserve, the abalone started being protected. And I believe too, Isabella, that the abalone are protected at Asilomar as well now.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for sharing that really cool history at Point Lobos. And it is really awesome to see and eye-opening to see how these abalone were being harvested at Point Lobos, since it is a very different place now with the protections that it has of the state park and the marine protected area. So not only here at Point Lobos and in the Monterey Bay, but all throughout California, these abalone were harvested for food. Sometimes they were harvested like at Point Lobos, where it was for a company, and sometimes it was just people going out for fun and for sport to harvest these snails. But unfortunately, that meant that their population is a combination of a lot of harvesting happening and hunting, and also disease that was spreading in the abalone population. That meant their population has dropped a lot. In fact, there are two species of these abalone that are still on the endangered species list right now, and there are more species that are threatened. So their population is not that big right now, and there are lots of people all over California that are working together to try to make sure that these abalones don't go extinct and that they can start coming back, because they are important for people, but also a part of the food web. So lots of animals depend on them too. And here at Asilomar, we do have protection for these abalone. We also have something called a marine protected area here, or an MPA for short. That's kind of like an underwater park where there is no fishing or collecting allowed. And there are some really amazing legacies here, because the marine protected areas here in this area of Pacific Grove were created by Julia Platt. She was the first female mayor of Pacific Grove, and she was also a scientist, one of very few women at the time she was alive in the early 1900s to have a PhD in zoology. And Julia Platt was really passionate about ocean conservation. And when she was mayor in this town, she created some of the first marine protected areas in California, because she knew that this ocean life was being harvested and hunted a lot, and that someone needed to protect them. So she took action. She rallied the town around what she believed in, and she created these areas where, in her time, there was no fishing or collecting except if someone had a scientific permit. And that was almost 100 years ago that she created some of these first marine protected areas. And I want you all to take a moment and think about what sorts of benefits would an abalone have to living in a marine protected area where there's no fishing or hunting allowed? How would it help this abalone population to live here at Asilomar or in Point Lobos, where there's protection too? And take a moment and think about that. Return to a partner if you'd like to share. You might have been thinking that living in this protected area means that these abalones can grow to these huge sizes. This is actually a red abalone, which I believe is the biggest abalone species in the world. They can grow to these huge sizes, they can have a lot of babies, and just start replenishing and rebuilding the abalone population, making sure that there are enough in the food web so that they don't go extinct. So it's really cool that we have this protection here and are looking out for these really cool snails. Now, I also wanted to talk about one of the main predators of these abalone that really depend on these snails. And that predator is this very cool animal. Does anyone recognize this species? You are recognizing this as a sea otter. You are correct. This is our friend, the southern sea otter, one of the amazing animals that also call Asilomar and Point Lobos home. And they are a top predator. They will sometimes hunt around the tide pools here, but they're also a top predator in their home of the kelp forest. What Ashley was mentioning earlier, which is this beautiful underwater forest where the kelp grows super tall. And that's often a place where we can find these sea otters too. And because they are a top predator, sea otters have a voracious appetite. That means they have a huge appetite. They need to eat a lot of food. And this is actually an adaptation they have that helps to keep them warm in the ocean waters here that are pretty chilly. They have to eat about 25% or a quarter of their body weight every single day. And to put that into perspective, I want you all to take a moment and think about how many quarter-pound Big Macs you could eat in one day. And maybe you can put that number up on your fingers when you have the answer. How many quarter-pound Big Macs could you eat in one day? Looks like Ashley could eat two. I could maybe eat three if I was really feeling hungry. You might have been putting up any number between maybe one or maybe even 10 Big Macs. But for our sea otter friends, let's imagine the sea otter weighs 100 pounds. It would have to eat 100 quarter-pound Big Macs every single day to stay alive. So 100 hamburgers, and this would be the equivalent of abalone. They could also eat purple sea urchins, crabs, clams, worms, octopus, all sorts of animals. So they have a huge diet and a very voracious appetite. So that makes them very important because they can help balance out the food web, make sure that there aren't too many animals that might be overgrazing on the kelp, which can sometimes happen with abalone or sea urchins too. So these sea otters are really important for the health of some of the ocean habitats here. But unfortunately, they were also hunted in the past. So one of the other adaptations these sea otters have is that they have a very thick and furry coat. They have almost or up to 1,000,000 hairs per square inch on their body. And compared to a husky or a really fluffy dog, those huskies usually only have about 10,000 hairs on an inch of their body. So sea otters are literally the furriest animal in the world. This helps keep them warm. But unfortunately, in the past, people also wanted to hunt them because of their furry coat. They wanted to make that coat into clothing. So there was, this was in the 1700s and part of the 1800s, so a couple hundred years ago now. People came here to hunt for these sea otters, and they actually, most people thought sea otters were extinct because they were hunted so heavily for their coats. And then in last century, in the 1900s, there was a population of these sea otters found just about an hour south of me and Ashley. So they are found in Big Sur. And these sea otters became protected by actually multiple laws. People were really worried, and scientists were doing research to try to find out how many sea otters were left. The laws were passed where the sea otters became protected. One of them is the Marine Mammal Protection Act that protects not only sea otters, but seals and sea lions and whales and dolphins. And they also became protected by the Endangered Species Act. So lots of laws came into place that helped these sea otters start to thrive again. And then when they started coming back into the Monterey Bay, some of the first places they were found were actually in the marine protected areas that Julia Platt had set up decades before they started arriving. So that is really cool because when Julia Platt was creating these marine protected areas, that was at a point where there weren't any sea otters around. But when she was helping to protect the coast, that ended up being really helpful for these sea otters because they need to eat a lot of food. They were coming to these areas first, finding tons of abalone and crabs and other animals, and starting to replenish their populations again. This is a super cool animal that you can look for if you visit Asilomar or Point Lobos. I know Point Lobos has about 100 of them living in the park year round. So it is really cool to get to see them so regularly now. And Ashley, I'd love to pass it over to you because I believe you wanted to talk about another animal that has been protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Yeah, but before we switch gears to our next animal, I want to add one more thing about our sea otters. Like Isabella mentioned, they are seen here at Point Lobos. And in fact, as I was waiting for all of you to join us this morning, I did see one swimming around in this cove right behind me. But sea otters love to eat those sea urchins. And by eating all of those sea urchins, they're helping the overall health of that underwater forest. And so during this World Ocean Week, we really want to say thank you to our sea otters for helping to keep our ocean habitats healthy. But staying along those lines of the marine mammals, we're going to touch on one more animal, a much larger animal that's not furry, but rather has a thick layer of fat called blubber. And maybe you could take a guess as to what you think that animal might be. And our last animal is our gray whale. And so when we think about people hunting these whales, it started back in the 1800s with a group of Portuguese whalers that arrived at Point Lobos and set up one of 16 whaling stations along the west coast of the United States. And they would use open top boats, and they would have a lookout on top of one of these hills right behind me here. And they would be looking for these whales as they were passing Point Lobos during their annual migration. And when this lookout spotted a whale, they would raise a white flag and to signal to the people down in this cove that a whale was approaching. If they were successful getting a whale, they would tow it back here into the cove. And they were using these whales for their blubber, that thick layer of fat. Because when that fat is melted down, it creates an oil that can be used to as the energy source for lamps. And I'm going to walk us over just across the street here because we still have some of those pots that were used to melt down that blubber and that I like to give you all a look at. And so let's go ahead and make our way over here and go ahead and flip us around here to give you a look. And so these pots are called try pots. And so the blubber would be cut into chunks, put into these pots, melted down so that they could use it to light their lamps. But then another energy source came along, something called kerosene. And with the use of kerosene, that meant that using this whale blubber was no longer necessary. And so, with that in mind, this tells us that we managed to change energy sources once to a slightly more sustainable one. And when we think about climate change today and combating it, one of the things that we can do is switch to renewable energy. And so we've done it once before and we can do it again. But also, today, these whales are protected, passing through this marine protected area here at Point Lobos. But Isabella, do you want to touch on a little bit more about some of the protections that these whales have today?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so we do see whales and otters pretty regularly in these marine protected areas. So these areas are places where they can find food, or for the gray whales, because they are migratory animals, they are just safe places for them to pass through on their migrations. And these whales are also protected by laws like the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So people are not allowed to hunt for them anymore, but also not allowed to harass or disturb them, because sometimes if people are going up to them on boats or if they're swimming near them, that can be really stressful and scary for the whales. So this is definitely a reminder if you are in one of these beautiful parks and you see a really cool animal, like maybe a seal or sea otter, it is super important to view them from a distance. Don't get too close, but you can take pictures and make sure that they are able to be relaxed and rested when they're in these protected areas. So these whales are also protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and some of them are still protected by the Endangered Species Act. So that is another law that protects whales and all sorts of animals whose populations are pretty low right now. Luckily, a lot of the whales that we see in Point Lobos are not endangered anymore, even though they were hunted in the past. So it is pretty common for us to see humpback whales and gray whales from shore, just depending on the type of year. They're kind of here at different points. But that is another really cool thing to look out for if you're ever visiting Point Lobos or at Asilomar too.
And Isabella, I want to chime in one more time here and mention that just right next to those pots that I just showed you, I'll flip us around here again because you can continue to learn more about the history of these conservation efforts and all the different uses of Whalers Cove in this building right here. That is the Whalers Cabin Museum, and inside there, it keeps track of all those stories for how the cove was being used. And it also has one of those diving suits that the Japanese used to harvest those abalone. So if you ever do come visit Point Lobos, highly recommend that you continue your learning and check out the Whalers Cabin Museum.
Awesome. Yeah, the Whalers Cabin is a really cool place to check out and learn more about the history of Point Lobos. And we want to thank you all so much for learning with us today all about these different animals, the abalone, sea otter, and whales that have been hunted by people in the past and are now protected and thriving in some places. And we hope you learned that even though there might still be and still are a lot of endangered animals, there are ways for people to come together, whether it is through passing laws or creating protected areas where we can help out these animals. And it's really important just to keep them in mind because there are a lot of stressful things about the environment right now. And remembering that there have been lots of examples where animals have come back and recovered is just something really cool to know about. In the last few minutes, I would love to answer some of your excellent questions in the chat because I am seeing a lot of really great questions. Thank you all for submitting those. Let's ask, oh, Ashley, let me pass this over to you. What are some animals you've seen in tide pools before?
Ooh, excellent question. So just like Asilomar, Point Lobos also has tide pools. On the south side of the reserve, I'm on the north side at the moment, but in those tide pools, I've seen sea urchins, hermit crabs, little tiny fish, sea anemones, mussels, sea stars. Haven't seen an octopus quite yet, but I haven't given up hope on that one. And also some snails.
Yeah, lots of snails, hermit crabs. We do get to see these really cool sea stars at the tide pools in Point Lobos and at Asilomar. And if you ever do get really lucky, you might even get to see an octopus crawling around. There are a lot of really cool animals that live in these rocky tide pools. And you might even see an abalone, the animal we talked about earlier. They call the tide pools home as well. There was also some questions about, is it rare to see a sea otter or gray whale in our parks? And it is pretty common to see both of these animals. I would say I see sea otters pretty much every single time I am out, actually either here at Asilomar or Point Lobos. And we get to see gray whales swimming by the shore between December and April. And there are thousands that pass by our coastline here. So those are actually pretty common to see, which is awesome because they used to be endangered. There's also a great question about or observation about abalones reminding me of horseshoe crabs. Are they related? That is a really good question. And I actually did some research into this as Ashley was talking. And it turns out that they are not related. Horseshoe crabs are actually related to arachnids. So they are technically more related to animals like spiders rather than other types of snails. So that is an excellent question and really interesting to think about. Let's see. There's also a great question about what are some other endangered species in the ocean. One of the very endangered species that a lot of people are working together to protect is called the vaquita. Ashley, I don't know if you've heard of the vaquita before, but they are a very small and cute. They're a porpoise, I think. And they're mostly found in kind of warmer, more tropical waters. So they're found in Mexico and Central America. And unfortunately, they are not being directly hunted, but they are being really impacted by fishing going on and sometimes getting tangled in the nets. So they are very endangered right now. And there's a lot of people who are trying to save them. We also have blue whales that sometimes come to this area in the summertime. Those are an endangered species still. So there's just about 2,000 of them, I think, found along the west coast of North America. So that is a super cool animal that I would like to see one day. Any other endangered species that come to mind?
Not at the moment. The vaquita is a great one.
Yeah.
And also touches on the importance of sustainable fishing practices because thinking about our whales, People are working to make better crab pots because sometimes those pots, when they're dropped down onto the seafloor, have lines on them and whales can get tangled up in them. But by limiting the crab fishery season, we can help protect those whales as well as develop better technology to better protect these animals as they're passing through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exciting that there are some solutions that people are coming up with to protect these animals. There are also some questions about what are the most common animals. I would say seagulls are probably the most common. Also, hermit crabs are animals I think I see on a very regular basis. So yeah, seagulls, hermit crabs, and we have lots of other animals. We do have different dolphin species, including orcas that also call the Monterey Bay home. And there were some questions about sharks. I have never seen one while just walking on the beach, but they do live in these marine protected areas, and they are actually an indicator that these protected areas are healthy. Having a lot of these sharks, which are also top predators, means that they're also balancing out that food chain, making sure there are not too many or too few animals. But they are probably pretty rare to see if you're just walking along the beach. But definitely a cool animal that call these protected areas home. There's another great question about rare fish. I would say that it would be very rare to see a deep sea fish. There have been some other state parks, like down in Orange County, where a deep sea anglerfish, which is that fish that has the little light that dangles from it, have washed up on shore. So I would say that would probably be the rarest thing to see here at Point Lobos or at Asilomar. All right. And I think we'll take one more question. Oh, there's a great question about, do jellyfish live forever? I know there is a really amazing jellyfish species that is able to, I don't know if it can clone itself, but it has some sort of adaptation where it can live for a very long time. And there are also some very long-lived fish species like rockfish, some sharks, and even some whales like the bowhead whale that can live for a couple hundred years. So some sea animals can live to some pretty impressive time frames.
And then also, isn't it the Greenland shark that can live
Yeah,
to be at least 400
yeah,
years
I've
old?
heard of that. Yeah, that is super cool. They're pretty funny looking. I'd recommend for you all to take a look at, maybe look up a picture of a Greenland shark after our program. But yeah, we are just so lucky to be surrounded by this amazing ocean environment that has so many different sea animals that call it home. That is one of my favorite things about the ocean, is just learning about all the cool animals that live here. And on that note, we want to say thank you so much for joining us today at Asilomar and Point Lobos and learning about saving Monterey Bay, all the cool ways that animals have become protected here. So thank you so much for joining and for your participation and excellent questions. And we hope to see you next time. Hopefully you can also join us on Friday morning for our live scuba dive, where divers will be going into the water right where Ashley is in Whalers Cove. So stay tuned for that. You can register for it on our Portscast website as well, and you'll probably see both of us there. But thank you all so much for joining, and have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.
See you all later.
Bye.